Hello viewers, today we will discuss the topic demographic transition and conflicts. Demographic transition is the historical shift of birth and death rates from a high to low levels in a population, a term used to describe major demographic trends of the past centuries. The changes in population basically consists of a shift from an equilibrium condition of high birth and death rates characteristic of agrarian society to newer equilibrium in which birth and death rates are at a much lower level. This theory has been propounded by W. S. Thompson and F. W. Notenstein. The classic demographic transition model is based on the experience of Western Europe, in particular England and Wales. The critics of the model argued that demographic transition is a European phenomenon and not necessarily relevant to the experience of other people of other regions, especially those referred to as less developed or developing nations. People realized that they did not have to have so many children to achieve desired family size, so birth rates began to fall. In addition, desired family size tended to decrease. As women found more opportunities to enter the labor force, they were less inclined to devote resources to childbearing rather than paid work, and the jobs they had were not conducive to having children beside them as they worked. The cost of raising children also increased as slightly wealthier families living in urban areas faced higher expenses for a larger array of physical and social necessities. This phased reduction in death and birth rates is a process called demographic transition, which will alter population growth rates in several stages. Stages of demographic transition. According to demographic thoughts or demographers, generally there are 4 stages of population growth. Stage 1, stage of high birth rate and high death rate. In first stage, a high birth rate and high death rate leave a little room for population expansion. In this stage, the country is at a low level of economic development. Agriculture, which is the main occupation of the people, is in a backward state, per capita income is low, and balanced diet is not available sufficiently to the masses. Death rate is high because of illiteracy, superstitious and lack of medical facilities. Birth rate is also high because of social and economic reasons. The main cause of it is that owing to joint family system, a person faces no problem in bringing up large sized families. Because of high death rate in this stage, people are not sure whether their offspring will survive. Hence, they are always keen to have larger families. Male children were also considered essential from security point of view. Agrarian civilizations are characterized by growing, stable or slowly growing populations with crude birth rate greater than 45 per thousand and crude death rate greater than 35 per thousand. High birth rates are balanced by high death rates. Stage 2, stage of high birth rate and low death rate or stage of population explosion. In this stage, because of high birth rate and low death rate, growth rate of population is very high. It is a situation of disequilibrium that cannot remain for long. In this stage, income begins to rise and economic activities expand on account of better health facilities and nourishing diet. The death rate falls rapidly. There is modernization of agriculture and expansion of trade, transport and industry. Birth rate in this stage remains high because of customs of the people, their rituals and beliefs, and views regarding size of the family, etc. that remains unchanged. Advances in sanitation and improved availability and quality of food, shelter lead to fall in death rate and an increase in life expectancy. This has usually occurred without an immediate change in the birth rate. Stage 3, stage of declining birth rate and low death rate. In the third stage, the declining birth rate and low death rate lead to low population growth. It is because, along with economic development of a country, structural changes in the economy begin to take place. Large number of industries are set up in the country. Large percentage of population begins to reside in urban areas. Most of the people are educated and their mobility increases. In place of joint family system, they prefer small family norms. Stage 4th, stage of low birth rate and low death rate. Low birth rate and low death rate lead to stationary population. In this stage, because of economic development, the standard of living of population becomes very high. There is also considerable change in the social outlook of people under the impact of urbanization and industrialization and high rate of literacy. Beyond the transition, some demographers have also suggested that there can be a fifth stage where fertility falls to very low level and stays there for a protracted period. A slow rate of population growth can then turn into a negative one. Figure 1 depicts the different stages as discussed above. The industrial stage is followed by population explosion, and this is further followed by post-industrial and stabilization stage. Figure 2 shows the different stages of demographic transition graphically in terms of changing birth rates and death rates. The population grows and then becomes stable in the fourth stage. Transition experience for developed nations and developing nations. The demographic transition began in the rich world in the 19th century, but did not happen in the poor world until the 20th century or later. Generally speaking, however, the third world has undergone a much faster demographic transition than the rich world did. As the 20th century began, the more developed countries were experiencing the transition. Birth rate fell in most of the developed countries during the late 19th century. American women were having 4 children on average at the dawn of 20th century, down from about 7 children in early 1800s. Fertility declined after 1900. The total fertility rate fell to about 2 children per woman in US and even lower in Europe during the world economic crisis of 1930s. The protracted fertility declines after the 1970 coincided with delayed marriage, more diverse, and increase in the percentage of women going to college and working outside home. The total fertility rate in many European countries fell below 2 children per woman by 1980. In early 20th century, most of Africa, Asia and Latin America were still in the pre-demographic transition stage of high mortality and fertility. The course of Mexico's birth and death rates over the century illustrates the situation in many less developed countries, though the speed and timing of decline varied substantially. Mexico's mortality and fertility rates were much higher in 1900 than Sweden's rate on the eve of those countries' demographic transition in 1770s, and Mexico's pace of change was markedly faster. Mexico's demographic history was echoed in many less developing countries, but with many variations. Some countries appeared to be rushing through the stages of demographic transition, while others appeared to be following completely new paths of demographic change. In the 1950s, the average total fertility rate was about 6.2 in less developed countries, a sharp contrast to 2.8 for more developed countries. The high fertility and declining mortality fueled explosive population growth in 1960s. The course of demographic transition is not clear in Middle East and includes North Africa and parts of Western Asia. Table 1 shows the demographic transition experience of Finland, which is a good example of a country which has passed through 4 stages of the demographic transition. Types of conflicts and factors relating conflicts with demographic transition. Conflict is an interstate security dispute which involves specific power political aims and demands having direct impacts on the national behavior. It is a discord arising within a group when the beliefs and actions of one or more members of the group are unacceptable to the other members. The factors that relate conflict outcome to the demographic factors are as follows. Role of technology. It is an essential factor in the conflict process. The higher the level of technology, the greater the demand for resources. This conjunction increases the propensities for conflict. Role of state. The capacity of institution to mediate conflict is intimately tied to the resources available to the various institutions and the legitimacy of these institutions. If perceived as non-legitimate, intervention by the state to deflect conflict processes can actually accentuate them. Role of perceptions, images and ideology. The political imagery created by representatives of the state is among the most critical in determining behavior. Thus, the creation and manipulation of symbols can add to the additional layer of uncertainty to processes that might link population factors to conflict. Figure 3rd shows the conflict outcomes can be related to demography through 3 circles shown in between them representing technology, state and images. Relationship between demographic transition and conflicts drawn upon from results and findings of studies. While the marked decrease in population growth in many countries and regions is a good news for those concerned about global population, however, it offers no clear relief for concerns about the security implications of population change. The pervasiveness of population issues can be seen today in almost all aspects of human society. While our understanding of these issues has greatly increased over last decade and a half, the implications of population dynamics for conflict behavior have not been well explained. Population, conflict and their interaction may be important factors in determining the kind of world we will face for the remaining decades of this century and those of the next. Conflict is a central feature of all political behavior at all levels of human interaction. There is an emerging consensus that if these demands are unmet, social dislocation, conflict and violence may occur. Detailed demographic information has been compiled for only 45 of 307 conflicts. This analysis was completed in 1974 and is a systematic study of these relationships between population and conflict. A major finding of this analysis was that existence of non-aggressive systems and aggressive systems can be traced to the internal demographic structures. It was found that there is a theoretical and empirical linkage relating population variables to conflict behavior and to violence. Out of these, in case of 45 conflicts, population transition played an important role. It was also found that population variables affect conflict both directly and indirectly, and conflict processes in turn have profound impacts on the demographic structure. The table 2 shows the types of conflicts and factors by which these are motivated. The conflicts can be colonial or domestic or political. Some political conflicts can also be motivated by the population factors. The figure 4 shows distribution of outbreaks of civil conflict along the path of demographic transition during 3 decades 1970-79, 1980-89, 1990-99. Note the clustering of outbreaks in the region of youthful age structures. The figure 5 shows the ratio between number of countries that experienced outbreaks of civil conflict on the younger side of the outbreak benchmark, where 60% of the population is under age 30, range from 11:1 in 1980-89 to 5.25:1 in 1970-79. How demographic transition reduces countries' vulnerability to civil conflicts. During last 3 decades of 20th century demographic transition, a population shift from high to low rates of birth and deaths was associated with continuous declines in vulnerability of countries to civil conflicts, ethnic wars, anti-government insurgencies and terrorism, resulting in multiple deaths. During the 1970s, 80s and 90s, countries in the late phases of demographic transition were less likely to experience new outbreaks of civil conflicts than those still in the early or middle phases of transition. And ironically, the likelihood of civil conflict steadily decreased for high-risk countries as they experienced overall decrease in birth and death rates. Each decade, countries in the earliest phase of demographic transition with birth rates above 45 per thousand had more than 40% probability of experiencing a new outbreak of civil conflict. This vulnerability descended until latest phase of transition in which countries had less than a 5% probability of an outbreak of civil conflict. While this association does not determine direct causation, the relationships found were striking and consistent. Migration and differential rates of population growth among ethnic groups competing for political and economic power have also played important roles in politically destabilizing countries. During the 1990s, there was a high proportion of young adults aged 15 to 29, a phenomena called youth bulge, and a rapid growth of urban population growth. When youth bulge was coupled with low availability of resources plus rapid growth of urban population, then countries had roughly 40% chance of experiencing an outbreak of civil conflict during 1990s. Currently available data cannot verify that a high death rate among working age adults, a characteristic of populations with high HIV prevalence, contributes to a state's vulnerability to civil conflict. So, the following can be noted. Countries in the early and middle phases of demographic transition as a group have been more significantly vulnerable than late transition countries to civil conflict. From the 1970s through the 1990s, a decline in a country's annual birth rate of 10 births per thousand people corresponded to a decrease of about 10% in the likelihood of an outbreak of civil conflict. Tensions between ethnic groups can arise when they cause threat to political character, traditions or cultural practices of one group or another. Refugee movements and other cross-border migrations regularly evoke fears and anti-migrant tensions in host countries. However, accurate data on ethnic composition and migration are lacking for most countries. Most of the world's countries are moving towards what could be called a security demographic, a distinctive range of population structures and dynamics that make civil conflict less likely during progress through demographic transition and gives countries a more mature and less volatile age structure, slower workforce growth. It reduces urban growth and gives countries additional time to expand infrastructure and to reserve the dwindling natural resources. Suggestions: greater political commitment and more funding are needed to expand foreign assistance programs to enable women and couples to choose for themselves the timing and frequency of childbirth. Governments should work with international organizations to improve girls' access to schooling and income generating opportunities. This will ultimately speed up demographic transition. It is important to articulate for policymakers the relationships between population dynamics and armed conflict. Those working in the national security community can help secure funding. Completing the demographic transitions worldwide will take an international effect. This could help in creating a more secure world. Conclusion. One function of government is to articulate priorities and establish these by influencing allocation of technology, resources and labour, thus shaping national capabilities. What population demands are and how are met and proposed to be met depends on the level of technology and resources that are directly available within national boundaries. Conflict and competition arise both domestically and internationally when efforts to meet demands are frustrated or constrained by existing capabilities or by action of others. In the entire calculus, the structure of the society's demographic characteristic is the most basic constraints within which the governments operate. In a broader development context, population and conflict share one important characteristic. An increase in either factor places burden on an already strained internal development agenda with regard to investment and consumption. Both investment and consumption must be reduced during periods of prolonged conflict. An increase in both population and conflict not only contributes to such burden, but adds reciprocal pressures. With this, we come to an end of today's lecture. In the next session, I shall talk about another related topic. Till then, goodbye and thank you very much.